Tēnā koutou katoa, kei te noho o kei te maro o kaitahu. Ko Sara toko ingoa. Nō rewa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. E nā mana, e nā reo, e nā karangatanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa, and warm Pacific greetings. So welcome to my talk today. Just a little bit, I am introducing myself here, a little bit about myself. I have put together this presentation and it is a mixture, so welcome to the Hei Kaupapa Hononga people. That's the word that I say all the time that I should get immediately right. And also welcome to department and others as well. So I've kind of got a mixture of a presentation here. Some bits might be a bit simplistic. Some of my students might have heard some of this before, but I'm trying to put it all together and create a bit of an argument around it. But in doing presentations over the years, I think I've come to realise what I'm actually doing with my research. So you could say that's taken me a while to figure that out. So for those of you doing your PhD, you've got plenty of time to figure out what you're doing. Well, perhaps it would be better to be organised earlier on. But I think the big thing that I'm really been looking at is around change. And I really want to understand how we can have change for sustainability and particularly the role of business in that change. So that's kind of what drives a lot of my research. Just to go back to here as well, these are some of the projects that I have been involved with and are currently involved with. So this research, the research aspect of this comes out of the work that I did in energy cultures a while ago. And the frameworks that I'm using, I'm translating into my current research projects that are just starting. So that's Āmi o Mea Aotearoa, which is looking at a circular economy for New Zealand. And in the National Science Challenge, I'm looking at the notion of science and changing ways that we might be doing science through mission-led science, and particularly in my brands project, which is looking at industry readiness for climate change. So, so the fundamental sort of theories that I'm using in this are the theories that I'll be using across those projects. So some of my colleagues from those projects are in this room, and I thought it was an opportunity to talk through some of the things that I'm doing as well. So it's a variety of things that I'm trying to do today. So I've kind of covered that there. So what I want to start with is a little bit around setting the scene, then look a bit at climate change as a strategic imperative, which I've been arguing a little bit recently in some public talks. And then I just want to move into that systems level change for sustainability and low carbon economies. So this is just some really basic stuff, and I'm going to whip through this really quickly, but I just want us all to be on the same page for where I come from when I'm talking about sustainability, and particularly climate change as well. So these are two really classic drawings around thinking about what we might think sustainability means. This one over here is generally called the weaker version, and this one here is called the stronger one. So I would generally sit in this kind of direction here, where I'm kind of thinking that, along with many others, I would say, that actually all of our activity really rests upon the environment. And our social structures, our social systems, and our economic systems sit within that environment as our larger sort of ecosystem or our bigger sort of system. So there's subsystems of that. Which means then that our economy is really a subset of our society, and therefore moving away from that idea that our economy is this rigid thing that we never can change, that's, you know, we're given and we have to work within, to actually thinking about as a society, it's a social construct, this thing called an economic system, and we have to think about it in that way. So that's part of my sort of thinking as I go through this. And then when I teach sustainability, as those of you who've been in my class know that I break it down into these components, and as you know, I kind of love these components, and they sit really nicely as well in terms of not providing a definition of what we think about in terms of sustainability, but actually thinking about what are some of the key ways that we can start to talk about and think about sustainability. They're kind of almost like some of our values, if we think about our key values around sustainability. And I think they sit quite nicely as well within thinking about sustainability within Aotearoa too, with some of these having some nice connectivity with some of our more Indigenous values too, like kaitiakitanga and things like that. So I'm not going to cover those, I'm just whipping through this to get us all, as I said, on the same page. Now, when I teach climate change as well, and when I talk about climate change to many groups, I talk about it in a particular way, and I channel Colin Campbell-Hunt, for those of you who remember Colin when he was in our department here, and this is kind of what I picked up from him when he was talking about complex systems. So if we think about the Earth as a system, it's actually undergoing changes all the time. So we don't actually have this very static system on our planet. But what climate change is doing is actually creating changes that are faster at a much quicker pace, and also are going to take us in a much different direction very quickly than we've ever seen before. So if we think we think about our Earth like this as currently interacting, then climate change is going to go poof and have this whole other system. And so therefore we need to be really thinking about what that other system might look like, and we need our businesses to be thinking about what that system is going to be looking like. And some of those changes we are predicting, and some of those changes are going to be have more speed and intensity than we could possibly ever predict, and we know that there. So our social system then, and when I often give this a talk, I'm talking often to businesses. Our businesses can either be reactive or proactive in that system and how they want to think about it, because that's actually what's currently happening in terms of our system. So that's how I kind of talk about climate change. Of course, I add in some science and some nice graphs and everything, but I won't give those to you today because we don't need those again. Okay, the other thing I strongly argue for is that climate change is a strategic imperative. In fact, I think I'm getting a little even outdated with some of the stuff around that, because I think actually it's going, and I'm going to argue, it's probably more a strategic necessity now for organisations. So there will be a need for businesses to adapt, and there will be a need for businesses to mitigate. So here's some of our reasons why our businesses are going to need to adapt, and what they're going to have to think about as we start to see that system change from some of our impacts from climate change. So these are going to be quite disruptive. And I think there was quite a lot of talk just after COVID around the fact that if we think COVID was disruptive, we'll just wait till we start to see some of the significant disruptions we're going to see from climate change. And secondly, businesses will need to mitigate. And we can see that really clearly this year when we saw the Climate Change Commission advice to government come out. There's going to be clear policy level changes that are going to mean that businesses are going to need to be thinking really carefully about how they mitigate for climate change. So how they start to stop emitting CO2, because we need to get to that net zero by 2030. So, but even in terms of our business models, as we start to see without any sort of policy level, we're going to see some changes that are going to happen that mean that our current business models will actually start coming up against limits, and therefore we'll see some sort of change around that. So in terms of businesses then, we're going to see change, we're going to see disruption, and we're going to see transition. And many of those are not new in our business world, because we talk about those quite a lot, but where those change disruptions come from may be quite different. Okay, so on top of that, and I hinted at before while I talk about the strategic imperative with businesses, I'm also now sort of saying, well, actually a lot of what is being done, particularly at the moment, is now really becoming a strategic necessity. So for businesses to think about their carbon emissions and start measuring and managing their carbon emissions, it's just going to be business as usual. Okay, and we're starting to see that shift now across our organisations. And I probably am being a bit premature, because I think there's still a way to go, so don't get me wrong, but I'm kind of just saying it, that actually that really is a strategic necessity now. If you want, as an organisation, to have a competitive advantage from thinking about climate change, we really have to start thinking about what, as the quote at the bottom here says, what are these measures that competitors cannot easily match. So we have to start thinking about innovation. So what types of innovation, what types of new business models, processes, goods and services, ways of doing things that businesses can develop in order to start to create more capabilities and a sense of strategic advantage from that. So I don't think I probably need that slide. I'm going to whip through that one there, because it's just talking a little bit there about your competitive advantage. But in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, we have a lot of SMEs. So it's all very well to give this talk and say businesses need to do this and businesses need to do that, and this is what businesses are doing globally, and we need to be on the bandwagon and doing all these things. But we actually have, as we know, a large number of micro enterprises across our country. But we don't necessarily want to let that hold us back. And this research here says that actually smaller organisations can actually take disruptions quite well due to their size. They can be more nimble, they can adapt there as well. So actually, while we do take, yes, there's a lack of resources and a lack of time, and that's what I hear constantly when I talk about climate change or sustainability to any business here, actually some of our SMEs may be more nimble than what they're currently thinking. But in general, we are going to need a very good policy mix to get the incentives right for our SMEs, but they will benefit too from being agile and resilient as smaller businesses. But we are going to need them to adapt. So, and this kind of comes through in this next piece of the research we've done, is around the SMEs are going to need that space and support for climate change innovation to occur. So, oh, I didn't realise I'd done that with that slide. That was very fancy. So what I actually want to spend today talking about is this part of the talk here. So that's just my kind of background, is to get me to where I sort of am with this research. So I want to talk about entrepreneurs, and I want to talk about change, and I want to talk about it from a systems perspective. So I'm going to use the context of the transport system. And as I said, this research came out of Energy Cultures, which is a while ago now, but we did go back to the participants as well and reconnect with them. So if we think about our current transport system, we are starting to see shifts in our country, but generally we still have, on average and globally, we generally have old vehicle stock, largely inefficient ICE engines, although we are seeing, as I said, some electrification and some and definitely increasing hybrid engines across the country. We generally have a lack of rail infrastructure. My latest bunch of Master of Sustainable Business students, some are from overseas, and are astounded at the fact that they can't travel by train to many places across the country. We surprisingly have low petrol taxes relative to other OECD. So I found that in research, but in numerous places, but it doesn't seem to make sense to us when we go to the petrol tap or fill up with petrol. And we do generally have a focus on road building, although we have seen some shifts away from that to more active transport and public transport in the last few years. But generally, when we think about the transport system, we have some very powerful institutional and infrastructural support in keeping our transport system as it is. But we now see that we can't stay as we are in order to meet any of our net zero targets. So transport is right up there with agriculture in terms of our key emissions in the country. And we can see from the latest climate change that the Climate Change Commission report that this is a key area that they're going to start tackling. There are many issues involved with this, equity issues and a variety of issues involved with how we actually shift that. But I just want to focus in on some of these aspects today, not just particular aspects around businesses in this role. So first of all, I just want to give us the context and think about this at that systems level. So when we think about getting in a car, there's a whole variety of things that enable us to get in our car and drive down the road that we probably take for granted and don't often really think about. And these are some of our key things here. So there is actually the vehicle itself, the fact that we have a car in front of us with all its technology that enables us to get to A to B, and the mobility aspect is in the way that we want to. We own that car usually, so there's a whole system of ownership and legalities around that. There's a whole supply chain that's particularly a global complex supply chain that's gone into actually getting your car to have all the right pieces and all the right places to get you to drive down the road. We can make our own decisions around our car, and that's something that we see in this country, particularly that sense of freedom and being able to do what we want and go where we want has been one of our kind of driving factors as to why we tend to own a car ourselves. And we have the culture surrounding our car. So when we go and purchase a car, there's a particular car that we might want, that we might see ourselves represented in particular ways. Not everybody that we see. I always give the example here of my next door neighbours that had his and her matching Land Rovers. You know, so that kind of thing, that we have that kind of, I know, we don't, that kind of aspect around our car, but we all know it. You know, the car is this kind of extension of yourself in a way. And then we have that environmental resource use in terms of all of our roads, and we think about our, you know, complex system of roads that we have. So when we start to think about what enables us to get from A to B in a car, we start to think about all of these different aspects that, you know, kind of can trap us into this and continue us in this way of operating. So I want to think about this though, and kind of keep that systems level approach and think about it around change. So how do we actually have this system that we seem to have all of these things that are set up for us to act in a particular way? How do we actually start to change that system? And so I'm using the idea behind socio-technical systems and the multi-level perspective to try and understand these systems. And this comes from a lot of work out of journals in the past, probably 20 years. There's a guy called Frank Giles who's at Manchester, who writes a lot, published a lot in Research Policy, for any of you who know that journal, in this area of socio-technical and the multi-level perspective. And so the socio-technical kind of argues that anything we have, we interact with as humans. So we don't actually have a technical system. It's always a socio-technical system, because human beings put their sense of meaning and have their sense of practices around any sort of material culture. So therefore, we can't actually separate that. And that's the kind of idea behind that. And in their socio-technical system, they talk about three different things here. There is that material culture as well, but there's that cluster of elements that are really important to form that system, which are your policies, your big science, your industries, your meanings, your markets, infrastructure that we have as part of that system. But they're created and maintained by those actors. So this is where we have those human aspect in there around how we interact with those elements. And that's really an important aspect there in terms of the supply side, but then in terms of the demand side, so our consumers or our producers there. And then there's sets of rules that actually determine those activities across the different actors that we have, and also our institutions as well. So those are our kind of key things that we want to think about in the system. So we get a really messy diagram that we use, and this is what's called the multi-level perspective here. I've taken this version of it from 2002 from Giles. It's gets adapted and used in lots of different ways, but generally everybody sort of goes back to this particular model. Now it does look really messy, and so it's trying to explain a sustainable transition, and I'm going to break it down in each part. So down here we have the niche innovations, we have the large sort of very stable, slow moving regime, and at the top we have the landscape there, which is our big sort of societal thinking. So I should have brought a clicker with me, will just break that down. So at the niche level, I always think of this as this bubbling of ideas and different innovations, and some of these generally can be quite radical. In other words, they're really different from what we currently have. They're going to disrupt that system. In this space, there's a lot of learning happening. So there's not necessarily the commercialization. We see that probably in the latter aspects of this space, but we have a lot of experimentation going on here around different sort of innovations. And as I said, there's small networks of actors here, and that alignment is really, really important. So it's about developing networks, sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, and then getting that alignment across there to start to gain some sort of sense of legitimacy of some of these, many of which won't go anywhere. So you can see the arrow goes back down, and we know that in an innovation space that not every idea is going to be taking off and changing and disrupting. And then we have the regime, which is that bit in the middle. And this is really important for the stability of systems. So these are our our sort of, here we go, industry, policy, science, culture, technology, and our markets. These are sort of the way that we do things. And we can't have this changing too quickly, because otherwise we'd always be flip-flopping as a society across different things. So we actually need that to change slowly, but sometimes, like for climate change, probably most of us think, yeah, but we need it to move faster right now at the moment because we need to get going. So it is that generally more slow moving. You can see the arrow goes up from the niche here when those elements become aligned. They stabilize and get that momentum and push up and bring about change to shift our regime into a new regime there. But it isn't very easily changed. And so the studies have looked at long, sort of longitudinal aspects of change over quite a bit of time. And then at the top, we have the landscape here, which is generally around our culture, our norms, our big sort of societal thinking about these issues. And that just kind of sits along the top, but puts pressure, as you'll see in the next one here, onto the regime as the pressure comes up from these niche innovations to actually shift and create a transition. So the whole thing, that's why there's so many arrows here, is because we've got around that kind of interplay of these variety of different things that are going to start to create change. And it can take a while, as I've described down here. It can, often there is no threat. Sometimes those threats are squashed, as we know, with disruptive innovation, that not every sort of innovation that has any potential is able to shift regimes, because they can be bought out by the regime or kept quiet by that regime as well. But usually for these elements here, when they start to get aligned, they get that legitimacy, and we see the landscape start to shift, and we can see that change happen. Now, I often hear use the example of plastic bags, which is a really little example, but I think it's quite interesting, because when the New Zealand decided, was that big push around no plastic bags, and the supermarkets decided that actually we won't have any plastic bags any longer, and there was a real uproar. And I saw someone in the warehouse yell at one of the shop assistants because they weren't giving them a plastic bag. And so there was quite an intensity there of emotion, clearly in that moment anyway, around removing of the plastic bags. And the supermarkets did a double take, the warehouse didn't, and then started providing the plastic bags again. So the landscape wasn't really quite ready for that shift to actually occur, and that's just a really little shift with a plastic bag. But then you could see the next time when the plastic bags got taken away, it just kind of happened, and everyone just took their bags along, and the landscape had obviously got to the point we'd got those enough innovation, which we probably had anyway, because we really had paper bags a long time ago as well. But we had that resurgence, and we had that substitution that was kind of, obviously the landscape had accepted it, so we could actually start to shift. So that's just a wee example. But so this isn't a perfect framework, but it's quite useful for starting to understand and think about change, and actually bring the different elements in and try and understand how the elements work together. So just a wee bit of background on the studies here, and I guess I'm trying to find that place to add and contribute knowledge. So in management, we really are quite strict about our contribution to knowledge, as our PhD students know, and we really make that clear position of where we are contributing. So many of the studies using the MLP to try and explain are very retrospective, so they look back on something that might have happened, like horse and cart to cars, as one of the case studies, and there's many other around sewage systems and different big sort of studies. And when we look retrospectively, we often try and tidy up the edges around things, and we don't often understand some of the struggles and that kind of rawness of actual change in there. So, so I'm arguing here around, there's not many studies around things that are actually transitioning, and therefore there's position to start to look at a system in transition. And the other big criticism of this theory is that there's not many studies that are actually looking at the actors involved in the system. So they often take that retrospective historical look across some sort of big historical case studies and look at how that system has changed, but not really from the perspective of people in it that are actually really trying to change that system. So that's really interesting to me, to actually understand those change makers in the system that are trying to bring that about. So, as I said, I'm really interested in those particular actors, and I've been looking and studying environmental entrepreneurs for quite some time now, a little bit in the social area, but probably more around environmental entrepreneurship. And I find them very interesting actors in the system because they're strongly motivated to change that system. So they want to change the world, but they want to change the world through doing something around their particular product or goods or services that they're offering. So, so that's of particular interest, and that's why I started actually looking at these transport entrepreneurs who are offering fossil fuel free sort of offerings to the market. But to try and conceptualize the actors and their role in the system, so this is what's taken me a while with this paper. I have actually ended up turning to social practice theory to try and look at how their practices are trying to bring about change and what practices they're looking at in that wider system as well. So, and that focuses on three different elements: the images and meanings, competencies and skills, and the material objects and how they're brought together. And there's work that's emerging in the past couple of years that are really trying to bring together this idea of social practice theory that's trying not to necessarily hone in on individuals, but look at the level of practice and putting that in with the multi-level perspective. So as the multi-level perspective is only, as I said, about 20 years in terms of its way that it's conceptualized at the moment, it needs different theories to help understand how it operates in different ways. And so that's where the social practice theory comes into play. So these are my research questions here. And largely, I really, as I said, want to understand that notion of from the actor's perspective around change in the system. And particular actors that I'm focusing in on here are what we could call environmental entrepreneurs. And I just want to understand what practices they've been developed, what are the key barriers, and how they might actually start to change the system. So we carried out interviews with 24 entrepreneurs, and as I said, it was kind of in the fossil fuel-free area, or just looking at alternatives to what was, I guess, considered business as usual at the time. They had to be operating as a business, so they already were in that large, commercialization state, so they weren't necessarily bubbling innovations as much as they're sort of developing and starting to align, but definitely in the time that we spoke to them, particularly the first time, they were nowhere near being part of that regime. And that was kind of really interesting to hear those stories. So these are some of the case studies we spoke with at the time around biofuels, battery technologies. That's an electric bike that goes very, very fast, and things like city hop as well. So just alternatives to kind of, as I said, our business as usual when we think about our mobility systems. So in terms of the analysis, I've done two types of analysis with it. One to do sort of a template to kind of look at the practices of the entrepreneurs, and then the other one using trying to look at the systems level change with the MLP. So I'll just run through some of the practices quite quickly, so you can get around to having questions as well. So some of these are practices that we would probably expect and we would see in many traditional types of entrepreneurs as well. So particularly the continuous innovation. So that was it came through across all of our entrepreneurs. There was around being able to continuously innovate and be particularly in the area of sustainability that's constantly changing and keeping up with what's happening there. Because they were having quite a bit of struggle to be accepted at the time that we spoke to these entrepreneurs, they very much looked to global markets. And most of them at the time were talking about actually going overseas to come back to New Zealand in order to legitimate the product or service that they were offering. So at that stage, there was very little legitimacy that was occurring here. Thirdly, we saw the building of relationships, and we know that's really important at that niche level, as those networks and those associations and that sharing of knowledge was really important. And you can see that here in terms of getting those contacts, and they all talked really in depth about those relationships that they had. And a lot of that was around that getting that legitimacy, similar to the global markets. We talked a lot about that changing infrastructure and the market. So what they were doing in order to try and shift and create a market and have the market understand what they were doing. And that was really important. So they talked a lot about how people didn't really understand their products or what they were trying to offer. And then they had to provide that education there around. And so sometimes if it was business to business, as the third quote there says, trying to illustrate to businesses how they can actually help them save money as well through energy management systems, through their transport. So, I mean, at that stage, they were having to, again, it's that education that they were doing a lot of there. And finally, like many of our entrepreneurs as well, they were strong on building both the service and the product value into the business model. And part of that was that education aspect as well. Because they were offering something that was quite different in the market, a lot of the time that the market didn't understand it. So they had to sort of offer sometimes a service alongside on how to use it, how to best get the quality or the efficiency that often was associated with their products. And so they had to have that often offer a service alongside. Many of them were doing that for sort of free in a way, in order to sort of push and bring about that education and legitimacy for what it was they were offering. So those are some of the key practices for change. And then we asked them about what they were actually wanting to achieve with what they were doing. And they talked a lot there about creating those new business models, but also sort of really starting to change what we have in terms of our system of automobility. So this next slide here should illustrate that. So this is trying to then translate this into practice theory, which has these three different elements that work together in a dynamic relationship in order to produce the practice. So this was what they were kind of aiming to do, and what they wanted to see. And so we sort of asked them as well, which I haven't got all the information for here, about how they saw the system at that current time. And there was a lot of words like lagging. So this was quite a few years ago. They sort of said New Zealand was way behind, we were lagging behind the technology. And so these were some of the material applications they were wanting to see shifted, the skills that we're going to need in order to start changing our practices, and what was important there in terms of the image or the meanings or the norms that we have as well, in order to start shifting our practices, and there sort of have different roles in there, whether they would supply that material, and then they had to obviously have the skills and changing those assumptions in order to really shift the practices. So also talked about the barriers, and this is where I think this is quite important for the multi-level perspective, because often these retrospective studies are not really pulling out the rawness around change and how hard it is as an actor in a system to bring about change. And so we found a lot of the businesses, when we talked to them the first time, were struggling, and found that there was a complete lack of support was really common for them. So as I said before, many of them were thinking of going overseas to come back again and gain that legitimacy. They just saw that there was, as the next point there, there's no understanding in the market and willingness to engage, so no willingness to pay that extra for that reducing the environmental impact. And a lot of them were very critical of local and national government as well, of being supportive of some of their offerings too. They saw the technology push there again wasn't really happening. They saw that we were lagging, and that they knew what was happening overseas but weren't able to bring it and create that. We're struggling to create the market in New Zealand. And plus, of course, and this is, you know, classic, and when we think about the regime, most of the businesses were very small compared to some very big global international players in our automobility system that need to be shifted. And so they talked a lot about that. And then I just pulled out this quote here because I thought this kind of showed that kind of struggle that they were going through. And in New Zealand, there seems to be a culture where they want to back winners, which is fine to a point. I think with innovation, you've got to back the little guys as well and give them the opportunity. And that's what they were really struggling with. And we, as I said, when you read through the transcripts, the struggle sort of comes out at you, which was one of the reasons why I really wanted to push that notion in the literature about that transitioning is a really important area we need to be studying, because it's all very well when we get to the end to look back on it. So my contribution then, and amongst this, is to add an extra arrow and already a diagram that's full of arrows. So you feel like you've done all this work and you're just doing a little red line. But what I really want to argue as I get into the discussion around the data is that these innovations and these technologies that are being developed down here actually are starting to also shift the landscape. So at the moment, the model just talks in systems about that regime being shifted from these guys coming up here, and then the landscape putting pressure on the regime to shift. But actually, I think there's a really important role of legitimating what's happening down here and the strategies down here to actually start to educate the landscape. And we saw this in this study, but I've also seen it across other studies that I've done with Joe Kirkwood as well across our environmental entrepreneurs, is really that education and that marketing aspect that's really being pushed at that more landscape level. Because if they don't manage to get some of that change up there, it's very difficult then to change that regime, because you are relying on those elements aligning there to push it, but you've not still got that landscape pressure in order to push it. So that's what I'm kind of looking at in research question 3 and arguing around. So, and I am going into, and I say I am going into because I'm still sort of writing the paper at this aspect here. So looking a little bit at structuration theory to help look at that relationship between agency and structure. So actors in a system and how they manage to bring about change. So every different action enacts or changes different ways, or the system in different ways. And it's trying to sort of understand that and use that. So our actors are part of the system, but they're also trying to change that system at the same time. And the market has to see the value that they're going to add in that system in order for them to be able to change it. And so I'm kind of looking at that tension between the landscape and that niche in order to actually start to shift that regime. And then arguing that education is one of the key practices that they're using to change it. And they're doing that through those different practices and those different ways to actually start to push and bring about change. So then to conclude, as I said, I'm trying to address that gap of understanding transitions as they happen, rather than the end product, and also looking at what I'm arguing is a neglected voice in the process, that entrepreneurial agent of change there. I'm going to argue that entrepreneurs are interacting at all 3 levels in the regime, rather than just at that niche level and pushing up to the regime. They're actually acting at all those 3 levels in the system. I also will be arguing, or am arguing, that it's not by not taking that retrospective perspective of the transition, we actually start to understand the struggle that actually occurs in these transitions, that they don't just happen nice and easily, and that it's important to actually recognise the actors, because some of the big systems multi-level perspective papers don't even mention some of the actors or change makers in the system that are actually bringing about that change. And I think from a business perspective, it's really important to understand the role that these actors are playing in the system. And finally, many of these actors will attest that a sustainable transition is going to be a long, slow process. None of them expect it to happen overnight, and many of them are in for the long run. So those ones going overseas, their full intention was to come back here to be able to operate in Aotearoa. So it's good to understand those practices that are going to bring about change in a system, and especially in one that's really entrenched and very complex like our transport system, that we really need to change. Okay, sorry, that's a whole lot of different theories. I'm trying to put them together in a short condensed period of time, but happy to take any questions for particularly where I know I haven't been clear. Oh, yeah.